Congress wants a moon base and a whole lot more. Soyuz can launch to the ISS again now that its pad is fixed. Japan's Kairos rocket accidentally terminates its third flight. And we got an unexpected view of an asteroid. As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. In a bombshell announcement at the end of last week, NASA changed the Artemis program, leaving us with a number of questions. But just a few days ago, some of these were finally answered through a formal press release issued by the agency. Now, to quickly summarize, NASA announced that it's changing the first lunar landing mission of the program from Artemis 3 to Artemis 4. Artemis 3 will now be a mission to test out the lunar lander systems and lunar spacesuits with crew while in low Earth orbit before the lunar landing takes place on Artemis 4. This has led mainstream media to believe that it'll delay the lunar landing, but in this latest release, the agency clarified that the lunar landing hasn't moved in time, just in mission. Artemis 3 will now occur in 2027, with the lunar landing, Artemis 4, still planned for early 2028. So at least according to the agency, Artemis 3 acts as an additional demonstration mission rather than a delay. Starting with that Artemis 4 mission, SLS will also be flying in a standardized configuration. NASA clarified this week that this would mean a new upper stage will replace the existing interim cryogenic propulsion stage instead of using the in-development exploration upper stage and mobile launcher 2. So even though the agency couldn't confirm this last week, this release now seals it. There are still so many questions left, but they'll probably be answered in the coming weeks and months. Right on the heels of that release, this week the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation advanced the NASA Reauthorization Act of 2026 to the full Senate. Now, this is just part of the process, and the full reauthorization has neither been finalized nor approved, much less enacted into law, but what's already been added to it so far gives us an idea of what Congress wants from NASA over the next few years. Of particular note are the changes introduced for Artemis, the Moon to Mars program, and human spaceflight in low Earth orbit by the chairman and ranking member of this committee, Senators Ted Cruz and Maria Cantwell. One big change compared to previous NASA authorization bills is that this one will allow the administrator to fund an alternative to the exploration upper stage, as well as find ways to standardize the SLS design to increase launch cadence. This would put into law what the agency is currently trying to do for Artemis 4 and onwards. It's quite a big change because previous administrations also tried to cancel the EUS, but were never successful, and the only thing Congress agreed to do until now was just delay its introduction. The amendment to this bill also recognizes that the rocket has not met its established launch cadence goals, and that the EUS is behind schedule in its development. These are some of the reasons included in the amendment to justify adding the possibility of changing to a different upper stage. Now, there's still some mixed language in the amendment because at one point, it also says that NASA should use all taxpayer-funded infrastructure at the Kennedy Space Center through the exploration ground systems. This includes the mobile launcher too, but at the same time, NASA is saying they're not using it. So that might be something worthy of clarification in the future. The amendment also requires the administrator to report to Congress on the development progress of the Human Landing System landers, directs the agency to keep the program to 2 providers, just like it is currently, and to consider the use of the lander technology for future Mars and deep space exploration capabilities. In the language of the bill, it also recommends that the administrator move the development of lunar spacesuits back to the agency if the commercial provider spacesuit, the Axiom by Axiom, is unable to meet cost, schedule, and performance requirements. Another big change of tune from Congress comes with the introduction of a directive to establish a lunar surface moon base. This base would establish a permanent crewed presence on the moon, as opposed to language in previous years that only referred to having a permanent capability or having a permanent presence, meaning that it could be crewed or uncrewed missions. The amendment also makes mention of an incremental approach with a distinction between an initial continuous capability, or in other words, that the base will be established but not necessarily crewed all the time, and a later permanent occupation by crew. This incremental approach would allow the agency to pre-position hardware and assets well in advance and in an earlier state of development than those needed for a permanent crew. On that same note, later in the bill, Congress would authorize the NASA administrator to use any commercial lunar payload services lander mission as a precursor mission for the lunar base, including the delivery of power generation, communications, and assembly, among other roles. This leverage is also added to another part where it states that the administrator may repurpose, reprogram, reconfigure, or reassign existing programs, platforms, modules, or hardware originally developed for other programs. Now, this could give a second life, for example, to the Gateway modules currently in construction and development. Some of these could be reassigned to other missions and serve other purposes that could help the program. In fact, the bill also tasks the administrator to meet with Congress to provide a plan for Gateway's future. So with this, it could suggest an option to repurpose Gateway's hardware if NASA were to cancel the station, as has been suggested in the past. Now, that's the major changes for the lunar program, but in low Earth orbit, human spaceflight operations continue, and NASA is planning to transition them from the International Space Station to commercial stations. The bill continues to mandate NASA to have a permanent human presence in low Earth orbit, and as such, states that the agency should keep using the ISS until a commercial station is capable of sustaining that presence. The bill goes beyond that and states that such commercial capability should have an overlap with the ISS of no less than half a year, meaning that such a station not only has to be online and capable of running a permanent crew, but also should have done so for half a year before the full transition to it. It's because of this that the bill also authorizes NASA to extend the life of the ISS by 2 years from the end of fiscal year 2030 to the end of fiscal year 2032, giving more room for commercial stations to finalize development. The amendment does state that NASA has taken a lot longer than it should to select the station providers for the commercial LEO Destinations program, urging the agency to move on with the program. Quite ironic, considering that Congress hasn't even fully funded the program to the requested levels. Now, the amendment also covers other areas aside from human spaceflight, including aeronautics and science, but covering these would make this story much longer than it already is. For all that, we'll be sure to cover it in more detail in a future episode of This Week in Spaceflight, especially once this goes from being just an amendment to being a full bill. The NASA news doesn't end there, though, as just a few days ago, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman announced the NASA Force. This is a new initiative aimed at recruiting engineers to grow what Isaacman calls core competencies within the agency. Isaacman argues that most of the agency's workers are actually contractors and subcontractors rather than directly working for NASA. His argument is that bringing this talent in-house will make the agency smarter, more agile, and more resilient. Not a lot of details have been given yet on how this initiative will work, but NASA said applications will be going out soon, so those will give us a bit more information about this process. And speaking of giving us more information about processes, this week NASA announced that it's finally fixed the issue with the SLS upper stage for Artemis 2. The agency had rolled back the rocket after an issue was found with the flow of helium to the rocket's upper stage. Engineers have since successfully narrowed down the issue to a seal in the stage's quick disconnect umbilical that was obstructing the path for the helium to flow from the ground systems to the rocket. The seal has now been replaced, and the issue has been fixed, allowing the flow of helium to the stage. In the meantime, work continues on resetting the flight termination system batteries, replacing the batteries in the core stage, the upper stage, and the solid rocket boosters, and charging Orion's abort system batteries. On top of that, engineers are replacing a seal on the liquid oxygen tail service mast umbilical while the other work is underway. This is interesting considering that it hasn't shown any problems in the past, unlike the seals on the adjacent tail service mast umbilical for liquid hydrogen. According to the agency, all of this work should be coming to a close in the next few days, and teams will prepare the rocket for rollout later in the month, allowing for a potential launch attempt during the April launch period. Soyuz launches are back on the menu. Okay, well, they weren't completely gone, but the only launch pad from which it could reach the International Space Station was out of commission for a while, and since the Russian segment depends on Soyuz for crew rotations and cargo deliveries through the Progress vehicle, it caused some uncertainty with the ISS schedule. So what happened? Well, if you recall, back in November, when the Soyuz MS-28 mission launched to the ISS from Baikonur, part of the launch pad's infrastructure collapsed into the flame trench. Fortunately, this didn't impact the launch at all. Cosmonauts Sergei Kudzverchkov and Sergei Mikheyev and NASA astronaut Chris Williams made it to the ISS safe and sound, starting off an 8-month stay at the orbital laboratory. But to us here on the ground, it certainly seemed like the ISS might not see another Soyuz or Progress visit for a while. When the smoke cleared after liftoff, aerial footage shown near the end of the official broadcast showed that something had collapsed into the flame trench, and it wasn't looking good. That something was quickly identified as the launch pad's service cabin, which is a multi-story structure that sits under the rocket before liftoff. Engineers use it to get access to the engines and other systems at the rocket's aft. The structure moves out of the way before launch, sliding into a cavity in the side of the launch pad where it's protected from the barrage of flames and energy released from the rocket. Reportedly, the structure wasn't properly secured after moving out of the way, and the rocket exhaust managed to pull it out of its hole, after which it dropped into the flame trench. Roscosmos quickly acknowledged the damage and stated that it would be repaired with spare components before the next launch. Many suspected that the pad would be down for much longer than Roscosmos stated, as the service cabin is a pretty significant structure. It's 19 meters long and wide and weighs as much as 17 tons. That's not something you've just got lying on a shelf in a shed somewhere. But Roscosmos did. This is where being an old rocket was actually an advantage. Russian space reporter Anatoly Zak reported that they actually had a couple spares left over from canceled plans to refurbish other Soyuz pads in the 1970s. That didn't make repairs simple, though. Remember, this is a massive structure, and it had to be inserted through an opening that it doesn't fit through. Besides, the spare was designed for older versions of the launch vehicle and its support hardware, so modifications were also needed. But nevertheless, they pulled it off in under 2 months, with more than 150 people working on the project. With the work now completed, Baikonur Site 31-6 is now ready to support another launch later this month. On March 22nd, the Progress MS-33 mission is set to lift off from the pad, carrying a whole bunch of supplies to the ISS. Let's just hope that they triple check whether the new service cabin is properly secured this time before giving go for launch. And if you want to follow along with that mission, you know what to do. Like and subscribe to get notified when we post our spaceflight updates. Space One's Kairos rocket has failed again. The Japanese company launched its rocket for its third flight on March 5th, lifting off from Space One's own Spaceport紀伊at 2:10 UTC. Kairos consists of 3 solid rocket boosters, topped with 1 liquid propellant upper stage. It's a small-sat launcher, capable of lifting up to 250 kilograms to low Earth orbit, if it can get there at least. And so far, it hasn't gotten anywhere close. The rocket lifted off for its first launch on March 13th in 2024, and it made it only a few seconds into flight when the flight termination system destroyed it. Apparently, the rocket's thrust was lower than expected, so it failed to fly its intended trajectory. The resulting explosion was spectacular, but obviously not the outcome that Space One had hoped for. The second flight lifted off on December 18th that same year, and it got further, but started tumbling late in its first stage flight, followed by flight termination. This time, Space One traced the cause to erroneous signals from a pitch sensor in the booster's thrust vector control system. This week, they tried flying Kairos again for its third flight, and about 69 seconds into the mission, the vehicle was again destroyed by the flight termination system. Shortly after the launch, company officials shared some initial findings, and here's the interesting thing. The rocket's telemetry and the video showed no anomaly before the automated flight termination system activated. So in other words, it seems like the system fired on its own, without reason, and actually caused the problem. Now, of course, the investigation into the failure is still underway, and there might be something that they haven't spotted yet. But for now, the flight termination system seems the most likely culprit, and that's quite an unusual failure. We'll have to wait and see what this means for Space One. Reportedly, the company isn't in a great financial position, and judging from the number of sponsor logos plastered all over the vehicle and the launch pad, it certainly seems that they needed a lot of support just to make this launch happen. Will they manage to stay afloat for long enough to launch Kairos again? I guess only time will tell. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with Tory Bruno. You may remember that in late December, Bruno stepped away from his position as CEO of ULA and started working at Blue Origin as president of Blue National Security. He was also known for sharing pictures and video updates of progress at ULA on social media, and despite his change of companies, he's continuing to do the same while at Blue. For example, he recently shared 2 different pictures showing the development progress of the company's Blue Ring spacecraft. One of them shows the first flight article for this spacecraft at the factory undergoing testing in preparation for its launch later this year. The other is of a structural test asset undergoing, separately, load testing at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. This testing is really important for Blue since it's selling this platform as a versatile spacecraft capable of doing a number of things, and it's part of the company's proposal for a Mars telecommunications orbiter. According to Tory, there are a total of 4 flight vehicles in flow right now at different stages, so we should see more updates coming later this year. Tori may have left ULA, but ULA hasn't stopped releasing updates. The company announced this week that construction of its new rocket delivery vessel, Spaceship, is nearly complete. The new ship will complement the existing one, Rocket Ship, that has been in use for more than 2 decades. The new transport ship is larger than Rocket Ship, with the ability to carry 2 full Vulcan rockets at the same time. This includes the Vulcan and Centaur stages, as well as the interstage and payload fairings. It's quite a pity that ULA recently suffered a solid rocket motor issue during the USSF-87 mission, because otherwise, this new ship would have immediately seen some action as soon as it entered operations. The company has been wanting to ramp up Vulcan's launch cadence for quite a while now, and has been slowly stockpiling hardware at the Cape for future launches, but with this issue, Spaceship may have a much slower start than what ULA probably expected. Remember last year when we followed along with that asteroid that had a chance of colliding with our planet in 2032? Well, it's back in the news. But don't worry, it still won't impact Earth. Asteroid 2024 YR4 was discovered in the final days of 2024, and in early 2025, astronomers tracking its trajectory discovered that it had a pretty high chance of crashing into Earth in 2032. Okay, so the chance was never more than a few percent, but most asteroids get nowhere near that, so it got quite a bit of attention. As more and more telescopes observed the asteroid, astronomers managed to measure its path more precisely and finally concluded that it would not impact our planet at all, bringing the chance of impact down to a confident 0%. But all that said, the moon wasn't safe yet, and when we lost view of the asteroid, there was a 4% chance that the asteroid could slam into it in 2032. Now, we thought that we wouldn't get a better measurement until 2028, but a team of astronomers figured out that the James Webb Space Telescope had a slim chance of detecting the asteroid twice in February of 2026. So they carefully pointed the telescope at it and were able to get in 2 more observations. It sounds simple, but the asteroid is very faint and many millions of kilometers away. Plus, Webb's field of view is so narrow that there was every chance that it even might have missed it, but it didn't. These 2 new images of the asteroid helped astronomers to refine the measurements of its orbital trajectory and precisely predict its position nearly 7 years from now. And that's how they found out that the asteroid won't impact the moon, or Earth either for that matter. Phew! NASA and the European Space Agency teamed up to release some new images of the Cat's Eye Nebula. This spectacular cloud of gas is located about 4,300 light-years from us, and as its name suggests, it looks a bit like a cat's eye. The 2 newly released images show the nebula in stunning detail, captured by 2 telescopes using their own strengths. ESA's Euclid Space Telescope captured a wide view as part of its Deep Field North survey, while Hubble exposed what's at the center in impressive detail by reprocessing some old images with some previously unused data. So what are we actually looking at? Well, this is a planetary nebula. In true astronomy tradition, that's not a very helpful name for this type of object. It was named for appearing round when viewed through early telescopes before we could see all of the intricate details. But these objects actually have nothing to do with planets. Instead, they're the remnants of dead stars which throw their outer layers into space in the final stages of their life. This creates the complex structures that we can appreciate with modern telescopes like Hubble, Euclid, or Webb. In fact, Webb recently studied another fascinating planetary nebula using its NIRCam and MIRI instruments. This one kind of looks like a brain in a transparent skull, so astronomers named it the Exposed Cranium Nebula. The structures inside these clouds of gas reveal a lot about the final stages of the star's life, so astronomers study these images to get to know more about the processes happening when a star dies. These aren't just pretty images, they're pretty useful for science too. We also got some news about satellite internet constellations. First, telecom provider Vodafone signed a deal with Amazon to use the LEO constellation, formerly known as Project Kuiper. This will help Vodafone provide 4G and 5G service in remote and hard-to-reach areas across Europe and Africa. Notably, this service will not connect consumer devices directly to Amazon's LEO constellation, but will instead connect mobile base stations to Vodafone's current network through a satellite connection. Vodafone expects the first of these sites to be connected this year, but that'll likely be limited by the speed at which Amazon rolls out its constellation. It's only launched a couple hundred satellites so far, so it'll take some time before they can offer global coverage. Now let's focus on its competitor, Starlink. This week, the SpaceX subsidiary renamed its direct-to-cell product to Starlink Mobile. As the name suggests, this product does directly connect mobile devices to the satellites, allowing users to connect to the internet anywhere without needing to haul around a Starlink terminal. With the rebrand, Starlink also dropped some details on the next generation of satellites that'll support the service. The V2 Starlink direct-to-cell satellites, or I guess Starlink mobile satellites, will provide a 100-fold increase in data density and deliver 5G speeds from space. That's fast enough for streaming and voice calls. As SpaceX, Amazon, and others keep launching internet satellites, we'll soon be connected to the internet everywhere we go. I mean, you can still turn your phone off if you need a break, but please just finish this video before you do so. Korean rocket company Innospace wants to launch from Nova Scotia. This week they signed a letter of intent with Canada's Maritime Launch Services, which operates Spaceport Nova Scotia. Innospace is working on a series of orbital rockets called Hanbit. In December, they launched their first ever flight with their smallest variant, Hanbit Nano, but it didn't get too far as it lost control and crashed into the ground after only about a minute. It was a small rocket designed to lift 90 kilograms into a sun-synchronous orbit, but was also the first. They're also planning the slightly larger Hanbit Micro to loft 170 kilograms, and beyond that, the Hanbit Mini to launch up to 1,300 kilograms of payload mass. The naming scheme has a lot of room left for larger variants, though. Now, all the numbers that I just mentioned are for launch from Innospace's launch site in Brazil, from where that first flight took off. But that's not the most efficient place to start if you're targeting the most common sun-synchronous orbits. You'd usually want something closer to one of the poles for that. So it's no great surprise that they've set their eyes on Canada. Spaceport Nova Scotia is still being built out, although a couple of sounding rockets have already launched from there. The site is currently licensed to launch up to 5,000 kilograms of payload and may have up to 4 launch pads. Scottish company Skyrora has also been in talks with Maritime Launch Services to launch its own orbital Skyrora XL from there, although that was a few years ago. Now Innospace is looking to add the site to its offerings, which are very global. Besides Brazil, they've also signed agreements to launch from Australia, and earlier this year added Portugal to the list with an agreement to launch from the Azores. Previously, they've also been in talks with Norway's Andøya, which the company still lists on its website. So soon, they might add Canada. The current agreement is effective until the end of the year, so they'll need to turn it into a definitive agreement before then. We just hope they'll also focus on getting some successful flights in the books so that they'll actually have something to launch from all of those sites. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. The space traffic this week was once again dominated by Starlink launches, but it wasn't the only thing that launched. As covered earlier, we of course had the rather disappointing launch failure of Space One's Kairos rocket, but also some successful non-Starlink launches with 2 Rocket Lab missions in the last week. The first one was a HASTE launch from Wallops with the mission That's Not a Knife. Although it was a suborbital launch, it was rather interesting as it was the very first HASTE mission that Rocket Lab covered live, with previous ones having been carried out in secret. The mission carried a hypersonic scramjet demonstrator that was so long that Rocket Lab had to build a special longer fairing for the mission. The company launched again later in the week, this time from New Zealand, with a regular orbital electron rocket. The mission, called Insight at Speed is a Friend Indeed, was for a confidential customer, but it's believed that it was carrying one of Black Sky's 3rd-generation Earth observation satellites. Up in space, Japan's HTV-X1 cargo spacecraft was successfully unberthed from the ISS and released in orbit. HTV-X1 will now carry out a 3-month technology demonstration mission on its own before deorbiting and burning up in Earth's atmosphere. Going into next week, we have more Falcon 9 launches on tap, including 3 Starlink missions from both coasts of the United States. But at least this time there is a customer mission coming for Falcon 9, and that'll be the launch of the EchoStar 25 communications satellite into geosynchronous transfer orbit. From Vandenberg, Firefly will again try to launch the 7th flight of its Alpha rocket. The company had originally carried out a launch attempt on March 1st, but it was scrubbed due to high upper-level winds. As you can see, schedules can be quite fluid and can change, so we always recommend that you go to nextspaceflight.com or download the Next Spaceflight app to stay on top of every launch. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.